retweet this. Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode where we at Arcana Network talk about all things chain abstraction, modular, and so much more, especially in ways in which we can try and help improve overall user experience within the blockchain space. So today, we have a guest with us who needs no introduction. Probably my first time speaking to someone who has their own Wikipedia page. But welcome, Ed. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Fantastic. Ed, before we get into like the deep end with things around the Ethereum's modular thesis, the direction that Arbitrum is going, and of course the problems that the modular thesis kind of throws in our face with fragmentation and whatnot. You just had such a stellar career thus far. You worked in so many different areas, contributing in academia, government, and so many other places. Would love to know like what that background has been and what got you into crypto.
Sure. Yeah, I've worked in a bunch of different areas, as you said. Early in my career, I was an academic. I taught computer science at Princeton University for all told 28 years. And then later also branched out into public policy, became a professor of public affairs, as well as computer science. And really got interested in the connections between technology, computer science on the one hand, and the big public questions on the other hand. From there, I got into government. I've worked now 3 times in the US government. Probably the most notable one was that I was the deputy CTO of the United States for the last 2 years of the Obama administration, which meant a senior policy advisor to the president on almost any issue that had to do with technology. And so, a very different kind of mission and workplace. After that, I went back to academia. I had been doing some research on blockchain and cryptocurrency before I went to the White House. And actually, the beginning of Arbitrum, the initial sort of idea that led to Arbitrum, happened in 2014, in early 2014, and grew out of academic research I was doing. And that kind of happened because I was working at this intersection of computer science and public policy. So anything that affects big public questions and also is technical in nature was right in my wheelhouse. So when Bitcoin came along, I recognized that this was the kind of thing that was really interesting, potentially hugely transformative. And so I started doing research on it with my students, starting around like 2011. Then when I heard about smart contracts, this really just sort of tripped a switch in my brain. And I thought, okay, this is what is really going to open this up, make it into a platform for innovation. So it's not just a way of moving money, but it's a whole new way of building technology systems and a whole new way that people could relate to the technology they use. More transparent, more community controlled, more accountable. So I get super excited about that. That led to the research that ultimately led to the creation of Arbitrum. But then I had this, then I got this job offer from the White House. And so I went off and did that for a couple of years. And when I came back to Princeton and was kind of decompressing, because the White House is like, it's by far the most intense job I've ever had. Came back, I was sort of decompressing, and one day these 2 PhD students, Harry and Stephen, walked into my office and said, "Hey, remember that Arbitrum thing? Let's work on that again." And that led to the academic project on Arbitrum. Eventually, Harry and Stephen became my co-founders in Offchain Labs. And So I've been now about 5.5 years full-time just working in Offchain labs and working on design of Arbitrum. For me as an academic, someone who had cared a lot about the impact of my work, the opportunity to have that more direct impact to actually build stuff that people would directly use. That was so too exciting, too interesting to say no to. And kind of in the same spirit as most of my career, where I've always been looking for new challenges. So that's how I got into it. Sort of a long story, but which only makes sense in hindsight.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So, so clearly it was like the idealism of your thinking and what blockchains and especially smart contract enabled chains sort of offered. The two kind of really met, and that was the spark.
Yes.
But when you were making this decision to start this off with Harry and Stephen, did it ever occur to you that you'd be entering into this industry, which is almost maniacal in nature to a very large extent, and you'd have to kind of at some level deal with all the other things that come with building a protocol in the space?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think we knew in principle what we were getting into. We didn't, as always, when you start off on some new venture, you don't really know what it's going to be like, but we had a general idea. We knew what the space was like, and we had some idea of what it was going to take. And actually, I think that my career up to that point had prepared me some, because the kind of very noisy public discourse and all the kind of politics and influencing and all of that happens in our field, that feels very familiar to someone who's worked in the White House, because you're dealing constantly with the political world there. Even though I was on the policy side of the house, thinking about what was the right thing for government to do and how, nonetheless, all of that is done. It's kind of similar to saying I'm designing a protocol and I care a lot about the technical aspects of that, but also what I do has to make sense and be messaged to this very large and fractious and noisy, often disorganized community. So that part was familiar. The sort of a lot of the parts having to do with running a company lined up with stuff I'd done in the academic side. Because I think a lot of people don't realize that especially in a field like computer science, if you're going to be successful as an academic, you have to be doing a lot of the things, you have to be really entrepreneurial. And you spend a lot of your time doing things like raising money, managing budgets, recruiting people, managing people, trying to get people to work together toward a goal, trying to deliver things that are required of you by deadlines. And so a lot of that felt familiar. But what really, I think, tipped it for me and made me so enthusiastic about doing this was just this sense that all of the stars were aligning for this to be the right company to start at the right time, right? Mm-hmm. We could see that, or we could see, although I think, not everyone believed it at the time, that scaling and gas prices were going to be an issue for smart contract chains. And looking at the solutions that were out there, we thought ours was better at the time. But also my co-founders were people who I was willing to trust in that way, willing to sort of handcuff myself to them for years to try to get this done. And they were willing to do that as well. So it felt like a really rare opportunity, and just sort of in line with my general career pattern of always trying the new thing. It seemed like an easy decision at the time.
Fantastic. No, it's great to learn about the genesis of all of these sorts of things. Yeah. So if you don't mind, just so we can switch gears, I think it's really important to kind of get your take on this one topic. So Ethereum was obviously, it's been some years now where they've clearly outlined this very modular approach to how they expect Ethereum to scale and Ethereum ecosystem to scale. And you guys have obviously been on the absolute forefront of making that reality, Arbitrum is what it is today, in terms of like having helped scale, bring down gas costs, all of those sorts of things. But especially now and today, where we're sitting here in this backdrop of a lot of noise and people, especially some would say it's engineered, some would say it's very smart, sort of like marketing ploys, but essentially people having a lot of so-called concerns about Ethereum's like modular roadmap. What is your unfiltered take on the whole modular thesis and how it's playing out, how it will play out?
Yeah, and I think it was a very, very smart move for Ethereum to decide to go to the layer approach for sure. I'm a big believer in layered designs for systems like this. I think we can learn a lot of lessons from the internet. The original sort of build out and growth of the internet, and then Web 2 as well. And some of those are things to do, and some of those are things to not do. But really, if you ask, what are the systems or ecosystems that have gone down the road that we're on? I think the internet is almost unique in having done that. And one of the reasons why we ended up with the internet architecture we did was because of layering. Excuse me, that in the beginning, in the design of the internet protocols, they didn't try to solve every problem in one monolithic layer. They did a really good job of decomposing the design, not into 100 layers, but into a few, and with really clear thinking about what each layer should do, right? And that's what's given the flexibility, because although a monolithic internet would have been a little bit more efficient in some respects, actually the layered internet is much better. It's more flexible. And that flexibility actually gives you bigger efficiency wins in other places. Because you're not locking in decisions too early, you maintain that flexibility, you can make good decisions. So a good example of this is the way that L2 chains can use data compression to reduce their footprint in the data availability part of Ethereum. And that's been a huge win. And if Ethereum had decided on its own data compression early on, that opportunity would not have been available. And they would have locked in a, say, 2014 approach to data compression. Whereas now we can use a 2024, 2025 approach to data compression and keep evolving that. So like, I think Ethereum's path has been really good. And I think often people who are arguing for something else are sort of trying to have it both ways. They want to have the benefit of the hindsight. They want to have the benefit of the flexibility. But it's got to be the case that the base layer that so much value is riding on has to be pretty conservative in the technical choices it makes. Anyway, so I think Ethereum did this well, and they did a good job of dividing the layers. And the big win of Ethereum, I think, is that Ethereum provides the most fundamental, most expensive, and most difficult to build part of the secure blockchain system, and that is economically secured consensus, right? That giant pool of stakers and the giant pool of stake, very large, very expensive, hard to build. And Ethereum made a great decision in focusing on developing that and then making that available to a higher level. So I think we're going to continue to see this. We see L3s on top of L2s. We see the architecture of L2s becoming more modular. We see decisions like the fact that Ethereum didn't try to dictate how every wallet should work, but instead allows wallet innovation. I think this approach of providing the fundamentals in a really thoughtful way and then letting 1,000 flowers bloom on top of that has been super effective. And I think it's going to be the reason Ethereum wins, that flexibility. Just allows wins on other levels of the stack. And I think there's this sort of narrow focus you could have that says like, how can we suck more of the activity that happens into a single monolithic thing. But I don't think that should be the, and that's really not the way, that's really not the Web3 way anyway.
Yeah, I think composable, modular, layered systems allow for greater innovation, and that's like you said, it's been the Web3 way from the very beginning, and nothing sort of espouses that as well as Ethereum does, and very well sort of put. But obviously now we're it was not very long ago. I don't know, a couple of years ago, where it was literally 3 or 4 like chains that were at the forefront of scaling Ethereum in these different ways. You guys, Optimism, of course, and a couple of others. And now we sit in a place here today, like you alluded to some time back, where there are L3s on top of L2s. There's so many L2s, and there are many more coming. And everyone has their own flavor, and then consequently you have Arbitrum has the Orbit chains, of course, and then OP has their OP stack with the super chain ecosystem, and so many other people, essentially enabling like this multi-chain future, which I think is where the bet is on, is that a lot of this is going to happen. But this obviously comes with its own set of problems, none larger than the fragmentation issue that we are seeing right now, where you have multiple very popular and widely used L2s, soon L3s, and app chains and sovereign rollups and all of these sorts of things, all of them having assets and a lot of value that is either locked or accrued and growing almost every day. But this puts the users and developers in such a predicament. Like, developers are thinking, where do we build? What's going to be bang for the buck? Where do we get our technology needs addressed? And users now have these wallets with money spread over across so many chains, with almost no hope in sight. So this fragmentation problem, what do you see as like the ideal or perhaps more pragmatic solutions to this problem?
Yeah, I think it's clear that we need to be working toward a better user experience where the friction involved in moving assets across chains, doing things cross chain, maintaining activity on different chains, where that friction is just a lot less than it is now. And again, I think we can learn something from the internet, right? When you're using different sites or services on the internet, you can see that you're switching services, right? You know if you're using, you know which desktop operating system you use. You maybe know which browser you use, but the experience is similar across all of them, and they all talk to each other. And the friction in moving across these different services is pretty low. So I think that's where we need to get to, right? I think people will still know and make decisions. Well, I want to use this chain, I want to not use that chain, because there's some difference in response time or security or economics or something. But you want to make it so that people can do multi-chain things, applications can work in a cross-chain way, and the friction involved in that is as low as we can make it, right? So for users, that's about user experience. For developers, it's about providing a kind of predictability and models for doing this. And we saw this happen on the internet, where especially things like application development. Right now, internet-based applications are can offer a great user experience because over time people figured out how to hide the fact that my email is actually lives on a set of backend servers, and there's replicas of some of those on my phone, on my desktop, and all of that. People figured out how to write an application. So to me as a user, it just looks like that's just like one service, and I have a window into that same service on any device I'm on. So sort of to get to that level where no matter how you're coming in, no matter what you're using, it operates smoothly, and the sort of cross-chain activities have the lowest friction we can get. I mean, that's easy to say. What you have to build in order to make that possible, and just figuring out methods, right? It didn't happen overnight that people figured out how to make these sort of server-based web front-end applications that we use all the time. And it took a while and some iteration, and people needed to learn from each other how to build those things, and then the tools would follow. I think we're going down that same road. It's going to get better and better. People are going to figure out how to, what kinds of tools, what kind of user experience, what can we do and not do. And we're going to see continuous improvement, just like we did on, in Web 2. In the sense that it'll become smoother and more predictable and faster over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So essentially, like, the ability for one chain to be able to interop with another chain is the ideal solution. Is actually lives upstream of developers and users, because it does not seem like it's the case today. Like,
right.
me as a user, if I want to do something on chain X but have funds on chain Y, I have to go bridge my assets. A developer who builds on chain X but is seeing a lot of users on chain Y now needs to almost like copy paste everything that they have on this chain on that chain, and now, instead of innovating on features for users, is now having to maintain DevOps for two different systems altogether. So yeah, fully aligned with that view that the ideal solution actually lives upstream of all of this. And like you said, the Web 2 examples that we see, I can build an email client for a user. The user doesn't need to understand what is happening. I can build any sort of client, because all of that is abstracted away in the protocols that actually handle everything in the back end. And that's where true innovation really happens. I want to circle back to this topic and ask you a question perhaps later on. But so just so we can build up to that one subject that I want to kind of touch on later, I wanted to kind of get your take on chain abstraction being like the 0 to 1 pragmatic solution that we can work with today, because essentially it doesn't look like you said, building this sort of seamless interop upstream of users and devs is something that takes a lot of time and effort and is non-trivial. But we have chain abstraction protocols and teams building out these sort of solutions, I mean, us included, who offer a way out for developers and users today. Would you care to just in your own words define chain abstraction, and what are your general thoughts on it?
For me, it's all about reducing the friction in doing operations that cross chains or move between chains. So you have a smooth user experience. The user doesn't have to live in a different UX world or do a bunch of importing and exporting of stuff when moving across. Developers can provide those experiences. And so, you need to have the user experience there so that the user doesn't feel that big friction in crossing those boundaries. Developers need to build their systems probably in a slightly different way or extend them so that they are capable of connecting to the cross-chain protocols or mechanisms. And then as protocol designers, people like me and the folks I work with in the Arbitrum community, and everyone across the whole ecosystem, we need to provide the low-level protocol rails on which this can all run. Right? Because it's one thing to say, we want user to be able to move funds from this chain to that chain in a fraction of a second. But if there's no way to actually coordinate activity between those two chains in less than, say, 15 seconds or a minute or 10 minutes, then you're not going to be able to provide that functionality in a way that's really smooth. So basically this is going to require work across a lot of different levels, but the thing we're trying to deliver is that the boundaries between chains just seem like like you're crossing a border, but it's not a border with, it's a border that just waves you through. It's not a border where they stop and search you for an hour and make you justify everything. Right? We want this to be really, really easy for you to do this stuff. And, you know, to me, that's really what chain abstraction is about. The user can make choices. Which chains do I want to be on? Which services do I want to use? Right? It's not like, you know, it's not like you're trying to provide exactly the same experience to every user and sort of force them into that. It's about supporting and empowering users to make choices. And then when they make the choice about what they want to do, that you can just execute that in a way that's smooth and trustless. To me, that's the big picture. It's just like the experience you could have on one chain. Now we want to be able to have that as smoothly as possible across chains.
Yeah, no, I think that definition that you stated early on makes a world of sense. Just basically removing the complexity of users wanting to do things across chains is probably the end goal. But if I were to kind of, you know, dive into, you also touched upon, you know, how you see the ideal solution sort of playing out. And you've said that as a protocol, it is sort of your responsibility as Arbitrum or Offchain Labs to give developers these sort of low-level functions and capabilities to be able to kind of enable this experience. So we obviously know that you guys are working towards something like this, especially for like the Orbit chains and things like that in your ecosystem. The optimism guys have like the super chain, and the zk-sync guys have elastic chain. Polygon's introduced the ag layer.
Yeah.
How do you see all of this actually working across these chain clusters? If, you know, when it comes down to things like value accrual and, you know, you doing good by your community of developers and users versus someone on super chain, because that seems like the biggest friction point here to reach that ideal solution is all these smaller tribes being able to kind of, you know, come to consensus and say, hey, you know, this is what it should be across all of us.
Yeah. So I think you've hit a really important point here, and that is that you want interop across chains to be additive rather than subtractive, meaning that, right, if you have a cross chain, if you're building a low-level protocol that can interoperate cross chain, it shouldn't be about locking out chains or trying to maintain a sort of building a fence and keeping only certain chains in. I think it's, you know, one of the principles in the Arbitrum community is your chain, your rules, which means that you should not have to give up the sovereignty of governance of your chain in order to interoperate, in order to get first-class interoperation. I think that's really important principle. And it goes along with interoperating across different technology stacks, right? That if nobody's telling you that you can't interoperate with, you know, if nobody's saying, no, you can't interoperate with that chain or you can't interoperate with that technology, if there's nobody out there trying to do that, if there's nobody out there saying you have to let me govern your chain before you can interoperate, then you can really have that open and additive kind of approach where anything or anyone can connect to anyone. And again, there's your internet lesson, that the internet needed because anyone could connect themselves up and be a first-class citizen in the network. I think that's really important. And for me, at least, in, you know, as our research team is working on protocols for interoperation, it's one of our goals that chains don't have to give up their sovereignty or yoke themselves to each other in some way in order to get first-class interoperation. It should be the case that you can go from anywhere to anywhere, whether it's in the same chain cluster, whether it uses the same technology stack, whether it has the same governance or not. That's really important because it would be a shame if we traded fragmentation across chains for fragmentation across technology.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to that point, do you think everyone else is probably also taking a similar view when it comes to interoperability? Or do you feel like, without needing to name any names, do you feel like, there are some people who would much rather, make sure that their like little cabal or their little tribe starts to accrue value and benefit maximally from any of these low-lying capabilities that you guys are trying to build and enable? Do you
Yeah,
see that happening?
I do worry about it. And I worry in particular about issues around governance. The idea that you have to give up governance control over your own
Mm,
chain in order to interoperate. It's more difficult to design a protocol that allows chains without common governance to have very fast interop. But I think as a community, we're about solving those difficult problems, especially when those difficult problems, especially when by solving them, we can further sort of openness uh, and trustlessness. So yeah, I mean, I do worry about this, and although I am nothing at all like a king of the Arbitrum community, or even, I'm just another guy with a voice. And the code will be what it will be, and the Arbitrum DAO will decide what goes on Arbitrum 1.
mm,
Or Orbit chains will decide, it's your chain, your rules means their chain, their rules, not mine.
mm,
But when I think about what it is that I'm trying to create and put into the world as a researcher, thinking a lot about ways of doing this that don't come with those limits. And I worry that others will either strategically not do that because they have some, business reason they see, or else that they will come up with solutions that require that because they'll settle on a solution or a protocol that requires that you sacrifice one of those things. And I think we just need to we shouldn't be sacrificing sovereignty um, or trustlessness or really unless we've really worked the problem and just gotten to the conclusion that there's huge user value in giving that thing up. But I'm
mm.
nowhere near ready to give up on governance, sovereignty, and trustlessness being and cross technology interop being requirements.
All right, great. Um, so this is the next thing that I wanted to quickly touch on is in this. There is a lot of this talk, especially in like chain abstraction circles, that we seem to kind of find ourselves in from time to time. Is this idea of um, uh, drawing an analogy of a chain with something in the Web2 world, which would look like, say, AWS or uh, GCP or Azure, and
Yeah.
saying that this like are pretty much how you should start to view chains. And then to further that sort of example, that would then mean like apps are where what should be front and center. Users should be using apps and not really worried about what chains they're on as such. And so this obviously sort of like starts to make like this sort of thinking has the potential to make this very huge shift in how chains interact with users, and how users interact with applications. What are your thoughts around this entire subject or this line of thinking in general, where users should only worry about the apps, not care what chain they're on, and those sorts of things? I think you've already kind of
Yeah.
stated your view, but would love for you to elaborate.
I think I mostly agree with that, but not all the way. And here's what I mean by that. It does matter what chain you're on. It does matter what chain you're relying on because chains differ in a lot of important ways still. Just like it matters. Like I might be happy enough to be on AWS or on, Google Cloud, but it's not the case that I don't care at all whose infrastructure I run on, right? Um, I think that's number one. Number two is in the Web 2 world, you use some service, you don't necessarily know which infrastructure providers they're using, but you're effectively trusting them to have done the legwork that you would otherwise have to do, right? I'm trusting that that application has done their homework, that they have checked out the infrastructure they're on. In the case of Web3, that means that if I'm just using the application and not thinking about what chain my assets or activities are on, I'm trusting that application developer to have thought hard about that and made good decisions on my behalf. I mean, a lot of user experience improvement can come from that, the fact that people are doing that. But it still matters which chain you're on. It's just that some of that decision making has passed, some of those difficult decisions have passed from the users to the applications. Right. And I think that's inevitable and good. We don't want users to have to worry about that. And in a lot of respects, application developers are in a much better position to make these decisions than, say, a typical user is. And so, I mean, I think increasingly users will be pay less attention to which chain they're on, but it will still matter a lot which chain they're on. It's just that the decision will be made more by someone else and abstracted away from the user to some extent.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember websites back in the day that would sport this secured by VeriSign or protected by McAfee sort of like logos in the footer, which would be my cue. This is before SSL and HTTPS and all of the sorts of things, which was my cue to learn if this was perhaps going to be safe or not. And then you just had people, copy pasting these things without any real sort of thing. But I think that's what you're sort of talking about, is these proxies for trust that users can get. Right now, the proxy is the chain itself, right? So me building on Arbitrum versus me building on something totally new, untested, unverified, and those sorts of things is where the longevity, the validation of the chain, and all of those sorts of things become that proxy. But from what you're saying, it seems to me like that needs to also perhaps change and become something else that apps can start now either advertising or leveraging to kind of convince the users that I'm built on something that is safe for you, and you can come with funds on any chain, and it's perfectly fine for you to use me.
Yeah, and on Web 2, the way this often works is applications will make these decisions, sort of ideally sort of thinking of themselves as standing in the user's shoes in doing that. And then they will publish information about all of this stuff so that the relatively few users who want to deep dive into how these decisions were made can do that, right? And so you have a few sort of security experts or people who are really, are deciding to spend their time probing these things, who go, and then if they discover that some application is using some terrible looking service, then they complain loudly about it, right? And that's kind of how it works in Web 2. I think we'll be moving in that direction as well, right? You'll see applications, you'll see other kinds of providers making some decisions on behalf of their users, providing information, some transparency about what they're doing and what decisions they're making. If you use our applications, here's a list of the chains that your assets could end up on. Things like that, right? And most users will be like, yeah, I trust that application developer. People seem to say that they do a good job of protecting my funds or my experience. And then, you have this whole discourse that goes on where you can question it, where you can question it. And then, but when that works well, what you get for most users is that they can trust reputable applications and don't have to worry about this stuff, right? And I think that's where we need to get to, because it's already the case today, right? That most users are not going to say, go and read the source code for the Arbitrum Nitro stack and sort of critique the way that some cryptography is done there. But people who care do, and security auditors do, and those security audits are published. And so there is this process for accountability and transparency. But most users are willing to say that, like, this has a good reputation, so that's good enough for me.
Yeah, I think we kind of saw this play out in a couple of ways more recently, where there were all of these users thronging to say something like pump.fun, but having no clue that it was on a particular chain, and that's what they were using. Same could be said of even perhaps Polymarket, where people were just using Polymarket for the features and for the benefits and for the idea of speculating on prediction markets without really knowing too much about the fact that it was built on Polygon, and or rather the contracts live on Polygon.
Yeah.
And this is what I think is where we will get to very likely, and this is also something that you're probably also suggesting that we ought to get to. Chains probably need to move a bit more into the background. Okay, great.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you can sort of postulate a sort of imaginary world where like everything is vetted by 87 experts before it ever goes on chain. But I think realistically, this idea of the kind of mechanism and process we've been talking about is really the only way to maintain the kind of fast innovation and experimentation that we have, which is a huge benefit that, which is a huge part of the benefits that we can provide, while also having some accountability so that people building things do pay attention to security and users get enough protection.
Got it. Great. All right. We're coming up towards the end, but there are two important sort of sections that I just quickly wanted to cover. One question and one last section before we let you go ahead. Yep. What is like the one thing that you're extremely excited about in heading into 2025? In general, need not be strictly Arbitrum related, but what are you excited to see?
I mean, certainly, Arbitrum related. I'm actually, and it's something we've talked about, which is I'm really excited by the possibilities in cross-chain interop. I think that's going to be an area of big progress in 2025. There's some really exciting things in the pipeline, and I think it's recognized by the community as a really important problem. So that's one of the areas where I expect a lot of improvement. I also think there's kind of a sense in the community that we're passing through some kind of inflection point, and we're going to see the growth of new types of use cases, new types of users going forward. And I'm really just excited to see how that develops. I don't know if I have a better prediction of how that will play out than anyone else does. But I'm always up for a new twist in the plot. And I think we are going to have some plot twists in terms of how it is that people use Web3 technologies and who the users are that are going to start playing out over the next year. And I'm always eager to see that. This one thing about this field is that there is constant change. That's what makes it fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's extremely well put. And yeah, interop definitely seems like the part we ought to be kind of focusing on and accelerating, so we can actually start attracting all of these users and fulfill this promise of Web3 and blockchains in general. All right. Last section of today's episode is a quick rapid fire sort of section. I have a few questions. I intend to kind of go through them. My only request is to keep your answers short and quick. And you can use one skip on any question that you feel like you don't want to answer. And all right. So if you're ready, Ed, we'll get started.
Okay.
What is your favorite L2 that is not Arbitrum?
My favorite L2 that is not, I guess my favorite that's not Arbitrum 1 is Arbitrum Nova, which I think has been really, although it hasn't gotten huge traffic, has been really valuable as an experimental test bed. That's a little bit of a cheat, but that's the best answer.
Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure I change up next time.
Yeah.
What is your favorite app built on Arbitrum 1?
Oh, probably the old, the classic old Uniswap. I think, for me, just the way it's developed and the way it demonstrated how you can build financial markets.
Okay,
that's old
great.
school, but I think still classic.
Yeah, no, very relevant, no doubt about it. Your top 3 thinkers within the Web3 space.
Oh, that's a good one. Let's see. But I think you have to go with Vitalik. Number one, he's been visionary in a lot of ways. As a researcher, I think I would go sort of to the economics area, and you've got somebody like Tim Roughgarden, who's thought in a lot of interesting ways and helped to frame chain economics. On protocol design, that's a more interesting one. I think probably folks who have been involved in, let's see, for L2, it's kind of a tough one. I think folks who are, I would say, so let me just say the Ethereum core developer community as a collective.
Okay, yeah, great. So next question, penultimate one.
Right.
The Web3 world 5 years from now, do you see hundreds or thousands of L2s thriving, or will we be just left with a handful?
I think you'll have hundreds to thousands. I think the economics push you that way, and the desire for customization. Also, it's a way of scaling. So yeah, I'd say hundreds of thousands.
Okay. And last question, not financial advice for anyone, but what do you think will be Bitcoin at all-time high this cycle?
This cycle, I'm going to say 200,000. But
yeah, I think
just emphasize that caveat. This is not financial advice. Yeah. I don't know
not
anything.
Financial advice.
My wild guess is
I think you just
use your own wild guess.
All right, no, great. Ed, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and thanks for sharing all of your lovely thoughts here today on the future of L2s, modular thesis of Ethereum, and interop in general. We feel very nice seeing that you guys are thinking about all of these things the same way as we are probably thinking, and it's good validation for people like us. But thank you so much for your time today, Ed.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for the great conversation, and thanks for everything you're doing, you and your team are doing to move this space forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Our pleasure. Thank you so much, Ed. Please take care. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye-bye.